I just wanted to qualify what I've just said, because I think in a way modern science has gone too far in one very important respect in this way. Aristotle thought of the world in terms of things seeking an aim, in kind of purposive terms. And one of the things Galileo had to do was to combat this sort of view and say, no, we need to think of it more in the way Archimedes thought of things, in terms of laws governing phenomena. And so in a kind of way, Aristotle became sort of, from the point of view of science, became the enemy. This has to be repudiated. And I think in one very important respect, this has gone too far, because it's gone too far in connection with life. Because the thing about life is that it is purposive, that it pursues aims. All living things, including plants, they pursue their aims through growth, but they nevertheless are pursuing it. They're goal-oriented. And it's a very simple thing, how do you define life? Naturally occurring, purposive things. That's what living things are. And biologists have been weirdly very reluctant to acknowledge this. And you find it affects the whole understanding of evolution. For example, Richard Dawkins, in a kind of way, wants to understand evolution in terms of genes, the selfish gene. Well, the selfish gene sounds as if the gene is purposive, it's selfish. But he says, no, it's just a metaphor. The way to understand evolution is, it's not a theory that banishes purposiveness from nature. It's not a theory which says that it looks as if animals are purposive, but they're not actually. It's just the genes operating. The way to understand evolution, Darwin's theory, is that it helps us to explain, helps us to understand how purposiveness has evolved and taken the multiplicity of varieties that it has, with all the different living things that there are, billions of different things that there are on Earth. So it's about this extraordinary evolution of purposiveness in an ultimately purposeless universe. So I think, and this actually affects, leads to a sort of distortion of Darwinian theory, because when it comes to cultural evolution, there is a kind of Lamarckian aspect to cultural evolution, and that tends to be downplayed and not given the emphasis that it needs to be given. An absolutely key thing to appreciate about Darwin's theory of evolution is that the mechanisms of evolution themselves evolve as evolution proceeds. Because when you start to get learning and imitation, you start to get cultural evolution, and that's a new way of forms of life being handed on from one generation to the other generation. It's not just through genes; it's also through learning, through teaching. I mean, actually, animals teach as well as just being imitated, and so and I think that whole picture, seeing Darwinian theory as about the evolution of purposiveness, seeing that what the theory is about and what biology is fundamentally about is living, the actual living, not just sort of bodies or genes, but the process of living, really changes things. And what it means is that we should appreciate that we owe a kind of enormous fund of gratitude to all our ancestors, these generations upon generations of our pre-human ancestors who over the billions of years or millions of years that they've been living have struggled to live, to rear their offspring. That if they hadn't, then we wouldn't be here. Of course, they didn't intend us. We're not sort of, they weren't saying we've got to do this so human beings can exist. But nevertheless, it's only because that they acted out their lives in the way that they did, that we are here.
It might help us as well, I think, to see, because intellectually we acknowledge we're animals, we've evolved and so forth, but something I like about that notion of purposiveness is that once we see that actually, by the fact of being human, we are also purposive, it might make us look at that a little bit and say, well, yes, whatever I do will be purposive. I'm not in this abstract mental plane. I'm not living a life that without meaning. Whatever I do will inevitably have meaning, because we've always had meaning.
Yes, and
it seems to be important that we recognise we have some responsibility, and that we're born with it.
And if you take this sort of Dawkins view, then you create a kind of hiatus between the human world, which most people would say we do have purposes, we do pursue goals, and the animal world, which is was supposed to. I once saw Dawkins give a talk at the LSE, and he was trying to get across the idea that it's absurd to attribute purpose to animals, and he showed the wonderful clip from Fawlty Towers, where Fawlty is trying to get some dinner to guests at his hotel, and the car won't start, and he famously gets a branch and beats his car and says, "I'll show you." And in other words, absurd to punish a car for not behaving properly. In other words, we're all mechanisms, and the idea that we have that animals have purposes is as ridiculous as the idea that a car has a purpose. Well, of course, a car isn't a purposive. Although purposes are associated with the car because we have purposes in designing the car to suit, but it itself doesn't have a purpose. So punishing it is kind of ridiculous. And I thought that was very illuminating, that he showed that it really does mean that he did, or anyway then, think in that way. And there isn't a hiatus between, if you acknowledge that animals are purposive and that their purposiveness has a crucial role in evolution itself, in all sorts of ways, because making choices about where you live and what kinds of food you eat can have subsequent consequences for evolution. The giraffes wouldn't have had long necks if they weren't stretching to get food high up, because there wouldn't have any survival value in it, which doesn't mean that struggling to get the food caused it, the long neck, but it was a crucial role. It wouldn't have happened without that. So there is this, and if you see evolution in these terms, then instead of sort of feeling reluctant to see how much we have in common with our mammalian cousins, as it were, we should be proud of the fact that we're animals. I remember thinking, when my parents were dying some years ago, and I was wondering how on earth I can bear this terrible time of awful things going on. And I remember thinking, well, I'm an animal, and animals have this incredible capacity to survive, and I'm an animal, so somehow I do. There is in each of us this great strength, this sort of animal capacity to this fierce desire to live, and this is a wonderful thing, and we should be immensely proud of our animal nature and our animal past.
And perhaps realise that we're actually one species. We are just the same, all of us. Essentially, there is not much point in my trying to prove that I'm better than somebody else, because actually we're two examples of the same thing.
Well, of course, that's a very animal type thing to do. Especially males. The mating season do a lot of that kind of thing.
All right, once the mating question's taken care of.
The things we think are all too human turn out to be all too mammalian, actually, or very often.
It might flip on its head something, that when you read about sociobiology, you sometimes get everything explained in terms of increasing your chance of successful reproduction. And if we're aware of that, maybe we should just recognise the fact that we've got the family, that's done with, that's dealt with, so now we're aware of all of this other stuff. We can acknowledge it and perhaps not be quite so badly fooled by it.
I think one of the things that I mean, the key thing, I think, is the development of language, which transforms things. And we, in one respect, are unique in that cultural evolution has absolutely taken off with us in a way. It exists in the animal world as well, but not to anything like the same extent. And that introduces all sorts of new possibilities. And so we can interpret survival in all sorts of different ways. You know, like we create a firm and we try and make sure that our children will take over the management of the firm and it will carry on in our name, or like me writing books that I hope will survive my death. In all sorts of ways. I mean, even a terrorist who goes and explodes a bomb and kills himself believes that he will then go up to heaven and will survive. So after all, one of the earliest signs of humanity that anthropologists look for is signs of burial rites. You know, one of the things that happens as a result of acquiring human consciousness is that you're really, I think, acquiring the capacity to imagine, and so you can imagine distant times in the future and discover, to your horror, that this business of survival is doomed in the end, that a time will come when you will die, and that must be absolutely traumatic discovery, because, you know, life is basically about survival, and reproductive success as well, and I think that has been absolutely traumatic for humanity, and maybe elephants too know about it. But there is some sort of evidence that they, when they encounter the bones of other elephants, they fondle them, and maybe they know about death as well. But I think most animals tend to know about death when it's happening, but perhaps don't know about it, don't think about it.
The introduction that you put on your website, you do mention this huge, I suppose, disconnect between our personal preoccupations and actually what is happening around the world. That there seems to be very little, people give really very little consideration to what we're doing as a species, because we're preoccupied with our everyday lives very much, and perhaps don't feel there's anything we can do. Obviously, that's a very worrying sort of state of affairs. But do you think, and you've addressed what people, you know, how universities work and how they should work. But is there anything that you think that we as individuals should be doing, if you like, or could be doing, that might change things?
Well, it does seem to me the big problem that we face, that I think in this book that I published just after you finished the course,
From Knowledge to Wisdom.
From Knowledge to Wisdom, which was first published in 1984. Somewhere there I say that our problem is really logistic. And by that I meant that that we were created, we emerged developing in small, scattered hunting and gathering tribes, and our whole psyches are designed to live in such a world where there are sort of 150 individuals, and everybody knows everybody else, and everybody has a kind of role in the society. And because of this and that, all sorts of things, we now live in a world of 7.5 billion people, I think it is. That's now our kind of little local tribe. And when we lived in small tribes of 150 individuals, it would if some problem came along, like where they're living, the source of food seems to be running out, it would be possible for everyone to kind of sit down around the fire and say, well, what are we going to do about it? Do we have to move to another location? And that isn't too problematic. It's not a logistic problem to have a discussion about it and come to a decision. But we now can't move anywhere because I think ideas of moving to Mars is a kind of fantasy. And it's become a matter of real urgency that we are a little bit more intelligent about the way we use up the resources of our planet and so on, live in balance with the rest of the natural world, amongst all the other things. And it's become, so we need a kind of global discussion about what our problems are and what we need to do about them. And this doesn't really exist. We're split up into different countries, different languages, and so on. But even, the best that we've managed to achieve so far is democracy, representational government, democratic government. But I think that the big thing that we're missing out on is our institutions of learning. Because I think that really ought to be the fundamental task of our institutions of learning, to help people improve their understanding of what our problems are and what we need to do about them, how we can act together to tackle our global problems and our sort of bit of our contribution to our global problems. And universities are just not doing that at present. They don't take public education of that kind as absolutely fundamental to the task of the university. But that's what they ought to be doing. What I was saying earlier, that wisdom, by wisdom I just mean, and I spell it out in this book, From Knowledge to Wisdom, the capacity, the active endeavour, and the desire to realize what is of value in life for oneself and others. So it includes knowledge and technological know-how and understanding, but it includes all sorts of other things as well, like the capacity to discover what is of value and to realize what our problems are and to have good ideas about how to tackle them and how to get on with others in order to resolve conflicts and problems. That's what we urgently need, is that kind of social wisdom, and it's that our institutions of learning should be helping us to develop. And that would mean the academic community being a kind of specialized part of the learning that should be going on in the broader world. So there's a kind of interplay of, it goes in both directions. Academia has things to learn from the social world. The social world has things to learn from academia. Academia should be siphoning up the best ideas, wherever they may be, about how to go about tackling our problems, and then broadcasting them to everybody so that we can all make use of them. And I think that's the serious lack. And we do have to discover how to do things with others, because if one is all on one's own, and you're confronted with global warming, population growth, plastics in the sea, and so on. There are things that you can do, but whatever you do, it's going to be so minuscule that the temptation is to think, oh, well, it's all hopeless. And it's really when we engage with others that we can begin to see, that something might be done. And it's the discovery how to do that seems to me so important and so lacking at present.
So actually just giving the thing consideration, thought, or just being aware that actually there could be a point, a serious, large purpose for academia, even that by itself, if a lot of people sort of share that view, that would be a very good thing, even if they're not academics, because academics are part of the world. They're people who talk to other people, and they might be influenced by that, or might start to see it themselves.
Academia should be a kind of resource for us to help us to discover how to tackle our big problems.
Something that Nick and I have talked about, or Nick's background, Nick Rhodey is in medicine, and he's talked about a lot of surgeons and older doctors who knew a lot of things that are not sort of recognised in medicine now, just from practical experience, from trusting their senses. And since in the last 90 years, medicine has become increasingly technical and based on clinical trials, almost exclusively and on pharmaceuticals and so forth. And it raises a question: how should? It's a question for us, and it's probably not something it may be something you've thought a lot about. I'm not sure about it, but what would be good medical training? What would be the way we should approach that question? Because obviously it's something that our students are very interested in, and it's a very difficult one for them because there's, the clinical trials cost many millions, most of them, and people aren't going to spend that on natural products which anybody else can then put on the market, and so there's no profit in it. And so our resources are very limited. And at the same time, people don't want to just make stuff up. So there is this big ground in the middle of acquiring knowledge and practice and learning from other people. But it's the status of that knowledge. How do we deal with this? The question, and it perhaps applies to social sciences as well. How do we deal with real practical problems that do demand intellectual rigor, that do demand a very careful approach where we're doing something socially important, but the scientific methodology that generally applied is either just not applied to this branch or just doesn't quite fit it.
Well, something has gone wrong if one can do nothing unless you do some immensely expensive trial, because you know, whatever one's doing, one should seek to learn about as one carries on. There's a doctor a GP who works in Wales called Healy, who has taken on big pharma for the dreadful things that big pharma can do. He gave a talk at UCL a year or two ago, which I went to, and in that talk he was lamenting the fact that the GP has become so involved with sort of the modern way of proceeding that he's lost what GPs used to have. And then he said it, wisdom. So I immediately sort of jumped from my seat that there's so instead of looking at the patient, one looks at one's computer screen, and I mean, from that the how GPs should act, it seems to me what wisdom inquiry would say is that you see the medical problems as an aspect of the human problem, the problems of the person, and of course in a kind of way, the task of the medical profession and the GP is to help the person to find a solution to the problem, and the medical problem is an aspect of that. It's all important, it seems to me, not to lose sight of that, because if you just isolate the medical problem and think of that as the problem and forget about the problem of living, then all sorts of damage can be done to the person, because all kinds of treatments may be applied which are not what the patient really wants and have adverse consequences. But about trials and so on, I suppose what I really think is that that if developing antibiotics, for example, is handed over to the private industry, then inevitably because the fact of the matter is that no new antibiotic has been developed for the last, I think, 15 years, 20 years or something, or maybe longer than that, because there isn't any money in it, or not much money, or not as much money as there is in other sorts of treatment for indigestion, which isn't such a crucial issue. 1 in 5 people, I read the other day, after operations get some or maybe not operations, just get infected with some bacteria that is resistant to all known drugs, which is absolutely terrifying. I think that we have to fund this research publicly. It should be going on in universities and not in private companies. then this problem that you raised wouldn't arise, because it wouldn't be the job of the research to make money. It would be to find cures to diseases.
Yes.
But there are sort of two parts to your question, because there's also the question of the GP, and I think the GP should be being scientific and being rational in learning from experience, and just learning how to be good at diagnosing illness. Seems to me to be, I mean, there are doctors that are good at that, and there are doctors that are not so good. And that seems to me to be a matter of experience, of learning from experience. And we shouldn't think that only kind of high-tech scientific research is the real thing, and everything else is no good. There isn't anything else. There is just that. Learning can go on in any context, and more or less. And I mean, maybe you can think of some contexts when learning isn't possible. I'm sure, but mostly learning can go on, and it's really important that it does. And if you restrict, I mean, my whole argument is that it's what really matters is the thinking that goes on in the social world. That's what really matters. That's where the attention should be, and we should think of scientific thought and academic thought as a specialized part of that is helping us to improve our thinking in the social world. That's what really matters. The thinking that is influencing our actions, guiding our actions, that helping us to achieve or not achieve what is of value to us and others in life. That's the fundamental thing. And alas, it could be better.
Yes.